something moved across the French countryside in 1944. The sky was clear, the wind steady. Yet below, patterns shifted, as if the land itself had come alive. Shadows stretched, whispers of motion stirred. Whatever it was, it commanded attention. A German reconnaissance pilot scanned the horizon. He snapped photographs, each frame hinting at a force that seemed real and yet impossible. Hours later, in command rooms far below, the images spread unease like wildfire. Orders were shouted. Positions shifted. Troops braced. Something was coming. But the truth, or rather, the absence of it, was even stranger. In war, deception is a weapon. Sometimes, the greatest victories are won without a shot being fired. The first night was thick with silence. Too thick. Across the French countryside, something was moving. From above, it seemed deliberate, almost rhythmic, as if the land itself had taken shape. Shadows stretched and twisted over fields and roads. There was motion, but no one could say for certain what it was. In the dark, a convoy wound through narrow dirt paths. Figures moved along hedgerows, crouched and tense. Radios whispered. Something clattered in the distance. Engines hummed faintly. But whether they belonged to vehicles or were merely echoes carried by the night, no one could tell. Colonel Barnes walked the perimeter with a practiced calm. His eyes scanned the terrain. He had learned early on that war wasn't always about bullets or cannons. Sometimes it was about anticipation, about reading the land and predicting what others might believe they saw. Tonight, every choice mattered. One wrong movement, one misplaced sound, could change everything. From a hilltop, a rustle in the hedgerow caught his attention. He froze. Footsteps? Animals? Or scouts testing the night? He signaled, and the shadow shifted just slightly. A subtle adjustment, enough to hold the moment in suspense. Hours passed. The wind whispered through the trees. Light from the moon bounced across the fields in unexpected ways. Sounds drifted from valleys and hills, some mechanical, some human, some unplaceable. Every noise seemed alive, purposeful. Every movement felt deliberate. Yet no one could be certain what it truly represented. Somewhere in the distance, a column of motion advanced. Not a full army, perhaps, but enough to make anyone watching pause, reconsider. Decisions had to be made. Commands were shouted. Troops repositioned. Maps were studied. Arrows traced. Reports compared. The observers sensed strength, a presence that demanded attention, though its nature remained uncertain. Back at the camp, the men worked quietly. Every action was measured. Every signal had a purpose, though what it was, exactly, no one outside the camp could guess. There was tension in the air, a nervous energy that made the night feel larger, heavier. The slightest sound could trigger a chain of events that might change the course of the hours to come. By midnight, patterns had emerged. Roads appeared busier than they were. Fields seemed alive. Something was happening, though the source remained unclear. Reports came in from scouts and observers. Eyes strained in the dark. Movements were tracked and catalogued. Yet the truth was elusive. Whatever was out there, it was convincing enough to make careful commanders hesitate. Colonel Barnes allowed himself a slow exhale. The men around him adjusted positions, whispered instructions, and listened intently to the countryside. All around, the night seemed alive, shifting, unpredictable, waiting for someone to make the first mistake. As dawn approached, a faint light painted the landscape in muted gold. Shapes moved again, slow and deliberate. Someone in the distance shouted, though no one could say who or why. Decisions would soon be made based on what was perceived, not necessarily on what was real. In the stillness, it became clear. The night had done its work. Something had changed. The tension had shifted. The land itself seemed to hum with expectation, and the men in the shadows, silent and watchful, knew that the hours ahead would demand all their focus, for in war, perception could be as dangerous as any weapon, and tonight, no one could be certain what they were facing. Morning broke over the French countryside, but light brought no clarity. The fields glimmered with dew, yet the shapes moving across them remained elusive. Observers strained their eyes, squinting into the distance. Figures shifted behind hedgerows. A column appeared to advance along a distant road, then vanished behind a slight rise. Whispers spread through the ranks. Was it a forward movement, a scouting party, or something far larger? German officers huddled over maps. They pointed, debated, and made calculations based on fleeting glimpses and uncertain reports. Nothing matched up. Reconnaissance suggested strength where none should have existed. Decisions hung in the air, heavy and indecisive. Something was out there, powerful, organized, and maddeningly unpredictable. Colonel Barnes watched from the ridge, silent but alert. The men around him were tense, their movements precise. Every sound, every flicker of shadow was accounted for. Even the wind became part of the equation. A rustle in the trees could signal an advance or a trap. A sudden metallic clink might be the enemy, or it might be nothing at all. Across the fields, signals flared. Small bursts of noise echoed. A shouted command, the low hum of engines, the rattle of unseen machinery. Observers far away reacted immediately, redirecting troops, hesitating, shifting formations. Each misstep reinforced the illusion of an organized, overwhelming force. Yet no one could see the full picture. They could only act on fragments, assumptions, and fear. By midday, the tension had reached a fever pitch. Reports came faster now, each more urgent than the last. They're here. No, they've moved. A battalion, or more. Hard to tell. Officers barked orders. Troops repositioned. Artillery was shifted to cover points that may not have needed protection at all. Every movement was dictated by what someone thought they saw. Yes, please hint at the ingenuity behind the mystery in. And what they saw was never quite clear. In the midst of it all, Colonel Barnes walked along the ridge again. He felt the weight of unseen eyes on the fields, the constant pressure of anticipating enemy reactions. A miscalculation could cost lives. Yet, paradoxically, the men below were acting as if confronted by an army that may not even exist. The fog of war was thicker than ever. The afternoon sun fell low, casting long shadows across the countryside. Shapes emerged at odd intervals, a fleeting column along a dirt path, the glint of metal from a distance, movement in the forests. Scouts reported with uncertainty. The tension was suffocating. It was impossible to know what was real, and impossible to ignore it. As night approached, the uncertainty reached its peak. Every soldier on the battlefield, every officer issuing orders, was caught between fear and speculation. Decisions were made in shadows, based on intuition and instinct rather than sight or certainty. And somewhere, unseen, a group of men watched it all, anticipating every reaction, every hesitation. They remained invisible, their presence betrayed only by the chaos unfolding around them. The fields of France, so quiet at first light, had become a stage. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of motion dictated the flow of troops, the movement of artillery, the choices of commanders. No one could say who held the advantage. The enemy feared strength where there was uncertainty. Every pause, every misstep was exploited. And so the night fell, bringing darkness that offered no comfort. Somewhere in the distance, unseen forces continued to shape events, bending the battlefield without revealing themselves. The soldiers believed they were responding to a threat, yet the truth was hidden, known only to those orchestrating the invisible struggle. In war, it seemed, the unseen could be more powerful than the seen. Dawn broke again, but the light brought little clarity. Mist hung over the fields like a veil. softening the edges of the movement below. Yet the motions themselves had become more precise, almost deliberate, as though guided by some unseen hand. Reports from the front lines arrived in scattered bursts. A column appears to be forming near the orchard. No, now it's shifted east. Signals suggest a concentration of forces here, but there's nothing visible on our maps. The words tumbled from dispatchers' lips, hurried, uncertain. Officers scowled over their charts. Every step, every repositioning, seemed to respond to a force that might not exist. Colonel Barnes observed from his vantage point, scanning the fields with meticulous attention. The men working around him moved with quiet purpose, adjusting instruments, signaling, repositioning objects that themselves seemed insignificant, but which somehow changed the battlefield. Every flicker of light, every faint sound, every shift of shadow seemed calculated to provoke reactions far beyond their immediate surroundings. He noticed subtle patterns emerging, barely perceptible but undeniable. A slight shimmer in the distance, a flash of reflection from a sheet of metal made observers reposition. A faint, rhythmic hum carried across a valley. Artillery units assumed it came from advancing engines and shifted to cover an area that may have been empty. And yet, the effect was real. Decisions were made. Troops moved, plans changed. All because someone somewhere anticipated how these small, clever manipulations would be perceived. Barnes allowed himself a grim smile. This was no ordinary operation. It required timing, creativity, and imagination. The battlefield was more than land and men, it was a stage. And someone had mastered its choreography. By midday, confusion had reached a peak. Patrols reported seeing forces that disappeared when approached. Scouts described columns that seemed to multiply and vanish at will. Every sighting contradicted the next. Maps no longer made sense. Commanders hesitated. Their certainty, always their strongest weapon, had eroded into doubt. In the shadows, the architects of this disorder worked tirelessly. They moved quietly among the hedgerows, adjusting subtle details. The angle of a reflective surface, the placement of a bundle that cast a convincing silhouette, the precise timing of a distant sound. Each small gesture was magnified by perception, producing effects far larger than the effort invested. It was an exercise in psychology as much as strategy. Even the most experienced officers found themselves second-guessing. Could a single battalion move with such speed and precision? Were they seeing the edge of a larger force? Were there traps they could not anticipate? The answers seemed always just out of reach. As afternoon approached, Barnes walked along the ridge again, surveying the field like a conductor listening to an orchestra. He noticed a subtle interplay of elements. A shimmer here, a rustle there, a sound from an impossible direction. The battlefield was alive, but not as it appeared. Every reaction, every maneuver, had been shaped by careful design, yet the design itself remained invisible. The enemy's confusion continued to mount. Units hesitated. Troops diverted. Decisions were delayed. Each pause, each misstep, was a small victory, silently orchestrated by hands that would never fire a gun or march in formation. The power lay not in what was seen, but in what was believed. By evening, the landscape had changed. Paths that had seemed open were now avoided. Artillery was positioned to cover areas that were empty. Patrols had grown cautious, uncertain where strength truly lay. The invisible architect had rewritten the battlefield without revealing a single secret. Barnes paused and looked out over the fields, the low sun casting long shadows that intertwined with the haze. The men had worked with precision, imagination, and timing. They had shaped fear, manipulated perception, and controlled action, all without exposing themselves. In war, it seemed, ingenuity could be more powerful than force, and those who understood how to wield it could bend reality itself to their will. As night fell, the fields quieted again, but the tension remained. Somewhere, unseen, The game continued, and every commander on the ground knew that something extraordinary had occurred, though no one yet understood how. The countryside lay under a heavy sky. Clouds pressed low and gray, as if the air itself were holding its breath. From a distance, the fields seemed alive, dotted with movement, lines of motion stretching across the hills, flashes of reflected light that came and went like signals. To the men watching from the far ridge, it looked like preparation for an enormous assault. To those closer to the source, it felt more like theater. Colonel Barnes stood among his men, his uniform dusted with earth, his face drawn from sleepless nights. Around him, the operation moved in hushed rhythm. Orders were given in whispers, gestures were precise, deliberate. Everyone seemed to know their part, though few spoke of it aloud. "Do they see us?" one of the younger men asked, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Barnes didn't answer at first. He looked out toward the valley, where a faint vibration carried on the wind. Rhythmic, mechanical, distant. It might have been engines. It might have been something else entirely. "They see something," he said at last, "and that's enough." Beyond the ridge, enemy positions were shifting. Reports came in from intercepted signals, urgent messages, sudden orders. Columns were being diverted, reinforcements called back from other fronts. The unseen presence on these fields had become impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, the effect was undeniable. Smoke rose from distant artillery fire, not aimed at real targets, but at what the enemy believed to be there. Each explosion tore through empty ground. The irony was brutal. Destruction aimed at shadows. The men watched from cover as the thunder echoed across the valley. A few exchanged silent glances, pride mixed with unease. They had made this happen, somehow, through means most would never understand. One of the sergeants muttered half to himself, "It's working." Barnes nodded slowly. "It has to." He didn't say what they all knew, that the success of this strange campaign wasn't measured in territory or prisoners, but in time bought and lives spared elsewhere. Every false impression here meant a real advantage for soldiers fighting hundreds of miles away. Yet the strain was visible. The men were exhausted, their nerves stretched thin. Nights blurred into days. They worked under secrecy, adjusting equipment, moving objects, watching the enemy react in confusion. Even small errors, a misplaced shape, a mistimed sound, could unravel everything. That afternoon, a storm gathered. Thunder rolled in the distance, masking the hum of engines and the faint crackle of radios. Barnes walked the perimeter as rain began to fall, thin at first, then steady. It soaked the fields and turned the dirt roads to ribbons of mud, but the work did not stop. He paused under a tree and watched as two of his men adjusted something by the roadside. They worked quickly, pulling canvas, tightening ropes, aligning something unseen behind a curtain of rain. The shape was indistinct, but the care they took with it spoke volumes. Barnes didn't ask questions. He trusted the process. He trusted them. When night fell, the storm deepened. Lightning flashed across the valley, revealing ghostly outlines, fleeting, half-formed, and gone as quickly as they appeared. In those brief flashes, the landscape seemed alive, with presence. To anyone watching from afar, it would have looked like an army ready to strike. Inside the command post, Barnes leaned over a map illuminated by a single lantern. Around him, his officers murmured updates. One report caught his ear. A large enemy division was pulling back, convinced they faced superior numbers here. Barnes closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. He felt a strange mixture of triumph and melancholy. Victory, perhaps but a hollow one, earned through trickery and artifice. Yet what was war, if not a series of deceptions? Outside, the storm finally began to fade. The rain softened to a drizzle. In the distance, faint glows of light flickered across the horizon. Fires, lanterns, maybe both. The men on watch whispered that the enemy was retreating. Barnes stepped out into the cool air. The fields shimmered faintly under the broken clouds. Everything was quiet again, too quiet. But beneath that silence lay something profound. The knowledge that what had happened here defied the ordinary rules of battle. They had turned emptiness into presence. They had made the enemy fight what they could not see. And though the men could not yet speak of it, not even to each other, they all knew that what they were part of was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The truth, however, would remain hidden for now. Because in war, some victories were meant to be believed, not understood. By the third morning, the fields were quiet again. No engines, no shouting, no movement, only mist curling low over the earth. The storm had washed away the tracks, leaving the countryside blank, almost innocent. Colonel Barnes walked through the silence. The men were scattered across the terrain, working with quiet focus. What had once looked like a battlefield now seemed different, peaceful, but only at first glance. He stopped beside what appeared to be a tank, a hulking mass of armor, its surface glistening with rain. Yet as he drew closer, the truth emerged. The shape wavered slightly in the wind, its surface trembling like fabric under tension. Barnes reached out and pressed his palm against it. It gave under his touch, soft, yielding, weightless. A tank, yes, but one filled with air. All across the valley, hundreds of them stood in silent formation, life-sized, convincing, and utterly false. Rubber and canvas, stitched and painted with meticulous care. From a distance, they looked perfect. Up close, they were delicate as stage props. Nearby, a small group of men knelt beside a cluster of equipment. Wires snaked across the ground, leading to speakers hidden behind rocks and in trees. One man adjusted a reel, and suddenly the quiet field came alive again. The low rumble of engines, the rhythmic clang of tools, the faint echo of men shouting orders. The sound was hauntingly real. Barnes closed his eyes, and for a moment, even he could believe it. Further up the ridge, others were at work with brushes and pigments, touching up camouflage patterns on canvas, repainting markings, altering insignias. They moved like artists, not soldiers, and indeed, that's what most of them had been before the war. Painters, designers, sound engineers, sculptors, men of imagination, not destruction. Together, they had created an army out of thin air. Barnes looked over the scene, the rubber tanks, the fabric trucks, the illusion of movement. It was astonishing in its simplicity and terrifying in its effectiveness. For days, the enemy had believed this valley housed a massive invasion force. They had diverted artillery, pulled back divisions, and fortified positions miles away from the real front, all to defend against ghosts. A young lieutenant approached, rainwater dripping from his cap. "Sir, they've confirmed it," he said. "The division we were tracking, they've moved east, completely." Barnes nodded. "Then we did our job." The lieutenant hesitated, looking around at the empty fields. "It doesn't feel like a job," he said quietly. "It feels like a performance." Barnes smiled faintly. "That's exactly what it is." He turned his gaze back toward the horizon, where the fog was beginning to lift. The illusion had done its work. Somewhere beyond those hills, real soldiers were advancing under the cover of this deception, their path made safer by shadows and art. For a long moment, he simply watched the wind ripple across the inflated tanks, the sunlight glinting off painted steel that wasn't steel at all. There was beauty in it. Fragile, surreal beauty, and a strange kind of honor. One of the engineers approached carrying a small box of paintbrushes. He was young, no more than 22, with a patch of dried pigment on his cheek. "Funny thing," he said softly. "We used to paint scenery for Broadway. Now, we paint wars." Barnes gave a weary chuckle. "And you're doing it better than anyone." The man smiled, then returned to his work, carefully adding mud streaks to a rubber tank's wheels to make it look more lived in. The details mattered. They always did. As the sun climbed higher, the fog thinned, revealing the full scope of what had been built here. Not an army of men, but of imagination. A battlefield constructed from illusion. Every sound, every sight, every scrap of evidence had been designed to deceive. And it had worked. Barnes stood alone at the edge of the field and took a deep breath. "They'll never know what happened here," he murmured. "Not for years. Maybe not ever." But he knew. They all did. They had waged a war without firing a single shot, and won. As the men began to pack up their tools, deflating the great hulks one by one, the air filled with a strange melancholy. The valley that had seemed so alive hours ago began to collapse in on itself, deflating into silence. The ghosts were vanishing. And with them, a secret that would remain buried for decades, a story too strange to be believed, too brilliant to be told. When the valley emptied, it felt almost sacred. The great figures that had once filled the fields now lay deflated and folded, their rubber skins stacked in neat piles. The sound rigs were packed away, reels of recorded engines and gunfire coiled like dormant serpents. The air was still, as if even the wind knew to tread carefully through what remained. For 3 days, that place had been alive with motion and noise, an army that never was. Now it was a graveyard of illusions, a stage after the curtain had fallen. Colonel Barnes walked the perimeter one last time, boots sinking into the damp soil. He looked across the empty land and thought of how much had been risked and how much had been saved. Entire divisions had been diverted, lives spared, all because of what these men had built, with paint, sound, and imagination. But victory here did not feel like triumph. It felt like vanishing. The men were silent as they worked. They were used to leaving without acknowledgement, without headlines or medals. They packed their canvas and air hoses and camouflage nets, dismantling an entire world that had never truly existed. In a few hours, there would be no trace they had ever been here. One of the younger technicians lingered by a deflated tank, tracing a finger across the faded U.S. markings. "Feels strange, sir," he said quietly, "like erasing ourselves." Barnes paused. "That's the point," he said. "We were never here." The man nodded, though his eyes betrayed unease. He looked out over the valley at the scattered footprints, the wheel tracks already softening in the mud. "You think anyone will ever know?" Barnes didn't answer. Later that afternoon, the convoy prepared to move. Trucks lined the narrow road, loaded with crates and folded tarps, carrying an army of ghosts back into secrecy. The men climbed aboard without ceremony. Their faces were drawn, but calm, the expressions of people who had done something extraordinary and would never be able to speak of it. As the last vehicle rumbled to life, Barnes remained standing by the roadside. Rain had begun again, a light, persistent drizzle. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small photograph, a black and white image taken from the sky days before. In it, the valley was filled with tanks, trucks, and camps. Every detail perfect. Every single piece of it false. He slipped the photo back into his pocket. The trucks began to move, one after another, disappearing into the mist. Their taillights glowed faintly in the rain, red dots swallowed by the gray. Barnes watched until the last one vanished. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction, leaving the valley to the silence it had known before the ghosts came. That night, they camped miles away under a canopy of oaks. The rain had stopped, and a pale moon hung low, filtered through the mist. The men sat around a small fire, the first they dared light in weeks. For once, there were no orders, no signals, no deception. Just the quiet murmur of voices and the occasional crackle of flame. Someone began to hum a tune, an old song from before the war. A few joined in softly. It was imperfect, tired, but real. Barnes sat apart from the group, watching the flickering firelight. The younger lieutenant approached and sat down beside him. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, The lieutenant said, "Do you ever think what we're doing changes what war is?" Barnes considered that. "War's always been about making the other side believe something," he said. "We just found a new way to do it." The lieutenant nodded, staring into the flames. "Feels like art sometimes." Barnes smiled faintly. "It is art, the kind no one will ever hang in a gallery." They sat in silence for a long while after that, listening to the forest breathe around them. Somewhere far away, faint thunder rolled over the horizon, or maybe it was artillery. In this war, it was hard to tell the difference anymore. By morning, they would move again. Another location, another illusion, another battle that would never be fought. And so they would continue, unseen and unheard, their victories written only in the movements of others, in hesitation, in retreat, in the absence of bloodshed. Years later, when the war was over, their names would not appear in textbooks. Their photographs would remain locked away in archives. The world would remember the great battles, Normandy, the Bulge, the Rhine, but not the ghosts who shaped them. Their legacy would live in whispers, in the gaps between what history recorded and what it chose to forget. And perhaps that was fitting. For in the end, the greatest illusion they ever created was themselves. Time had softened everything. The war, once a raw wound, had become a collection of fading photographs and folded flags. Those who had lived it carried its weight quietly in the pauses between conversations, in the distant look that sometimes overtook their eyes. For most of them, life after the war meant returning to ordinary things: paintbrushes, studios, storefronts, families. The men who had once created illusions of war now painted portraits, designed theater sets, or built radio stations. They blended back into a world that had no idea what they'd done. For decades, the secret held. Files stamped classified gathered dust in government archives. Even those who had been there rarely spoke of it, not out of fear, but habit, a silence that had become part of who they were. Until one day, it began to surface. It started quietly. A declassified document, a line in an obscure military report. Then a historian found something, aerial photographs that didn't quite make sense. Soon, the whispers grew into questions. And the men who had carried the secret for so long began, at last, to speak. In a small community hall in New Jersey, the folding chairs were arranged in neat rows. At the front, a banner read, "The Artists Who Fooled Hitler." A modest crowd had gathered: journalists, students, veterans, and a few families clutching old photographs. On the stage sat 3 elderly men. Their hair was white, their hands unsteady, but their eyes were clear, still holding the spark of the artists they had once been. One of them, a thin man with a sketchbook on his lap, adjusted the microphone. His voice wavered at first, but then it found its rhythm, calm, deliberate, almost musical. "We weren't supposed to exist," he said. "We made a war out of shadows." The audience leaned forward. He told them about the night spent painting in the dark, the sound trucks that rolled through empty fields, the inflatable tanks that fooled the Luftwaffe's cameras. He spoke of the fear that someone might stumble too close and discover the truth that the mighty army across the river was nothing more than canvas, air, and art. The room was silent. At the back, a young journalist whispered, "How did no one know?" The old man smiled. "Because it worked." Another veteran spoke next, a former sound engineer who had spent his youth recording and layering noises to mimic the movement of an armored division. He described stringing speakers through trees, hiding amplifiers in haystacks, and timing the rumble of trucks to echo across valleys. "We didn't have weapons," he said. "We had turntables." The crowd laughed softly, then fell quiet again. For an hour, they spoke not as soldiers, but as storytellers, painters, magicians, men who had waged war not with bullets, but with imagination. And as they talked, something shifted in the room. The audience began to see them not as relics of history, but as artists whose greatest masterpiece had simply gone unseen for too long. In the months that followed, their story spread. Documentaries were made. Museums reached out. Historians called it one of the most audacious deceptions of the 20th century. But for the men themselves, the recognition felt surreal. One described it best. "We spent years pretending to be something we weren't. Now we have to get used to being seen." When the government finally awarded them official honors, many were already gone. Those who remained accepted the medals quietly, without fanfare. They didn't stand tall like heroes. They bowed their heads humble, almost embarrassed by the attention. Colonel Barnes was long gone by then, but his name surfaced in the records. His notes, once sealed in a metal trunk, were displayed behind glass, a few pages of sketches, maps, and terse handwritten lines. At the bottom of one report, he had written, "Success measured not in enemy deaths, but in the absence of them." Visitors lingered there longest. Years later, one of the last surviving members sat on his porch overlooking a quiet lake. He was 96 now, thin as paper, but his mind was sharp. A reporter had come to see him, to ask the question everyone asked. "Do you think what you did changed the war?" The old man smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the still water. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe it changed something bigger." The reporter tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, his gaze soft but steady. "We proved you can win a war with creativity. That imagination can save lives. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make someone believe." The wind rustled the trees. A distant bird called. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, calm, endless, and quietly true. The ghosts, at last, had come into the light.